So good evening. This is February 23rd, Tuesday, and we have as our plenary lecture guest speaker tonight, Daisy Rooks from the Sociology Department, who will be speaking to us about homeless under the big sky, how homelessness in Montana compares to rural homelessness in the U.S. And I'm going to pause the meeting now until we're ready to get started. So welcome everybody. I'm really delighted to have Professor Daisy Rooks here to speak to us about homeless under the big sky, how homelessness in Montana compares to rural homelessness in the US. And we have Luke and Jenny to do the introductions here. And you've got mics on either side of you if you want to do that. I'll turn the webcam so I can capture you.
Can you hear me through this? Okay, it's on. For tonight's plenary lecture, we have the honor of hearing from Dr. Rooks, pronouns she, her, hers. She is an associate professor and the department chair of the sociology department here at the University of Montana. In 1997, she completed her self-designed major, graduating from Smith College with a BA in urban studies. She then attended the University of California, Los Angeles, graduating with a master's in sociology in 2001 and a PhD in sociology in 2007. Dr. Rooks started teaching in 2003 at the University of California before working as a visiting professor at Rutgers in 2008 and finally landing here at the University of Montana in 2009.
Dr. Rooks has published papers on the contemporary labor movement, organizer retention in labor, gender and union campaigns, and service learning, which is a form of education where students mix engagement in the community with reflection in order to build skills while having a positive impact. Dr. Rooks is currently researching rural teacher shortages, the pedagogy of teaching teachers, and homelessness in rural areas and small towns. Currently, she is working on a book manuscript about homelessness in the Intermountain West. In 2019, Dr. Rooks won the Outstanding Faculty Advising Award, and in 2020, she was voted Best Professor at UM in the Best of Missoula Choice Awards. She teaches her classes with hands-on learning strategies and humor. Let's all thank Dr. Rooks for joining us tonight.
Oh, come on. Tim Nichols says hello in the chat. Can you all hear me? Sort of? Okay. Great.
You have any problems with anything here?
Nope.
Okay.
I'm good.
Turn
I'm
me
going to
off.
ignore the chat though. I'm going to ignore the chat as I talk. Okay. No, it's not, but I'm just going to, yeah. I like to try to monitor what's happening in the chat, but I can't do all of it. Okay, so I'm going to set a timer for about 45, 50 minutes. I'm going to give a talk, and then I hope to use the rest of the time for Q&A. And I got a version of your reading questions from Dan. Do they call you Dan? Dr. Spencer?
Yes.
Dr. Dan? And so I do actually have some answers to them, and I've integrated a few of the answers to the questions into my talk, but I think we'll have plenty of time afterwards to discuss. So I'm a sociologist, as you know, and some people say, what is sociology? And my answer is always sociology is normal everyday things made unnecessarily complicated for your pleasure. So that's our discipline. If you get interested in sociology during the talk, grab me after the class session and I can tell you about other courses that we offer in our department. I teach in the inequality and social justice option in our department, so most of my classes and most of my research focuses on the topic of inequality. So I will just jump into things here. So here's what I plan to do today. This evening, I plan to talk a little bit about rural homelessness. What is it? What do we know? What is rural? What is urban? Somebody asked in the question, is Missoula urban or rural? Great question. We'll get into all of that. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit. I'm going to use that discussion of rural homelessness. I'm going to draw on that Janet Fitchen article quite a bit in that piece. I know it's an old article. It's from 1990. And in many ways, it's the definitive article about rural homelessness in the US, one that is still cited and used enthusiastically to this day. And hopefully you got a sense from that article about why. Janet Fitchen is really trying to question a lot of our preconceived ideas about what homelessness is, what it looks like, what it's like to be homeless, and how it's really different to be homeless in a rural place. So her research was ethnographic in nature. She talked to people, she observed people, she wrote down what they said. All of her research was conducted in rural communities in New York State. So a couple people asked about why didn't she talk about indigenous populations and reservations. One reason is because of the location of her research. It's a really community-based, community-focused research. There certainly are indigenous people in New York State, but they're not the same amount and number and prevalence of reservation lands there that there are here. But I will say a little bit about that topic because some of the most interesting research on rural homelessness comes out of Canada and really looks at indigenous, what are considered rural remote communities. And if anyone is interested in anything that I talk about today, I can send you to other places to learn more. I'm just going to try to give you a little overview. Then I'm going to tell you about this research that I'm doing in Montana. I'm going to tell you about my motivating questions, a little bit about the data that I use, and then I'm going to present some of the findings from my research. And I'm really going to focus on the draw of rurality, how real and imagined rurality keeps people in Montana and in smaller cities in Montana when they become homeless, even though there are not that many resources or services there. And I'm going to really talk about how race, imagined race and real race, pulls people into Montana from elsewhere when they're homeless and pulls people home to Montana when they become homeless elsewhere. So I'm going to make an argument today that really is heavily highlighting the role of race and racial ideas and assumptions, and use it to tell you a little bit about what I think is unique about homelessness in Montana. Then I'll end with some discussions and conclusions. I'll talk a little bit about implications of my research for policymakers and practitioners, and then we can get into solutions, legislation, any other questions in the Q&A. I really often find the Q&A to be the most interesting part of these kind of events, so I'm going to leave plenty of time for it. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to just say a little bit about terminology. I know a lot of times in public forums, we introduce ourselves using our gendered pronouns. You're going to hear me do something that's going to sound awkward and a little weird in this talk, which is I'm going to talk about people experiencing homelessness, not homeless people. And there's a reason for that. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm using what's called people first language, which is you're using language that really highlights the humanity of somebody in a underrepresented group, rather than highlighting the condition or struggle or situation that they're in. So for example, rather than saying that person is disabled, we might say that's a person who uses a wheelchair, or that's a person who lives with a disability, rather than saying a homeless person, or the word that we use all the time here in Missoula is transient. And that word really drives me insane when we're talking about homelessness, because homelessness is a homegrown problem in our state and in our community. It's not something that came from somewhere else. We have, as a couple of people pointed out in your questions, we have a massive mismatch between wages and the cost of housing in this community, and those are the factors that cause homelessness. But we talk about transients, and I'm always like, the actual transient population in Missoula is the student population at the university. Transients, people who are homeless, most of them were born and raised at least in the state of Montana. So anyway, language matters when we talk about homelessness as well. I really like to use people first or person first language because I think it reminds me and my audience that these are people, not a constellation of problems. And a lot of people in these interviews that I conducted for this project, that myself and my students conducted, really talked a little bit about how dehumanizing language can be around homelessness. So here's a little taste. This is a quote from a guy named Martin, who's a white guy who grew up in a rural area and became homeless in a rural state. He says, people usually dismiss the homeless as being this sort of monolithic group of people who are mentally ill or very criminally oriented and otherwise not part of mainstream society and not going to ever be part of mainstream society. We aren't all one monolithic group that you can kick because you're having a bad day or something. And I think this really highlights the importance of using people first language and just being cautious about how we're describing certain groups and what kind of assumptions we're making about them. So you can't really see this, I'm sorry to say, but I'm going to address this question: what is rural? What is rural homelessness? What is homelessness? And then we'll move into the heart of the matter. So most people that study any kind of rural community or phenomenon use the US Census Sometimes they use the USDA. There's a couple different definitions of homelessness, but I'm going to go with the census definition, which is the most commonly used. A rural place at its very core is a place that has less than 2,500 people in it. Anything over 2,500 people, any community over 2,500 people with a few, there's a little bit of nuance in this, but for the most part, a community over 2,500 people is considered not a rural community by the US government and the US Census. So then you're like, what? You could think about a city of 5 million people or a community of 3,000 people, and according to the census, are they all urban? And the answer is yes. Although the US Census talks about micropolitan areas, that's 2,500 to somewhere around 50,000. Metropolitan areas are 50,000 and more. There's a range of different types of urban configurations. But really, when we're talking about rural communities, our technical definition is smaller than 2,500 people. So Missoula is not rural, and many communities that we think of as rural in Montana would not meet that federal definition of rurality. It doesn't mean that we need to use that as our only definition, but just in terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about rural homelessness, knowing what the cutoff is for the federal government helps us understand some of these definitional problems that Janet Fitchen brings up in her article about why is rural defined in such a narrow way, what's it really like to live in a rural community. There are all these other complicating factors about whether, if a small place is right next to a city, is it a suburb, is it a rural area, really complex stuff that we can get into. But part of what I'm trying to do with this graph that you can't see, I'm sorry about that, is show you that the way that the census has defined urban has changed many, many, many times over the years. And as the population centers of our country change and change and change, I think we're going to see changes to how the federal government defines rural and urban as well. But as of today, the cutoff for the federal government is 2,500 or less is rural, 2,501 they would consider urban. Okay. So what is rural homelessness? Well, Janet Fitchen in her article really talks about a couple different characteristics of homelessness, some of which exist in rural settings and some of which don't. So she talks about literal homelessness, visible homelessness, and people who are potentially homeless. And really what she's doing, and some of you got this in a really smart, sharp, and accurate way, I saw it in your questions, is that Janet Fitchen is trying to argue that in rural areas, we should have a different definition of homelessness in order to better capture the reality of people who are what we might call precariously housed. And so Janet Fitchen is really arguing in this piece that rural homelessness should be defined differently than urban homelessness. And she's really talking about people who are, just like the title of her article, on the edge of homelessness or potentially homeless. And she really argues that that should be more central to the definition of homelessness in rural areas. Some of you asked in your questions, well, has the federal government changed their definition of homelessness since Fitchen's article? No. I mean, no. She spent her entire career yelling about this issue. I mean, I don't mean that in a dismissive way. She was very passionate about this issue. She had a huge impact on our thinking about rural homelessness. She died kind of tragically early. Other people have taken up this mantle, but the federal government is like, no, we have the definition of homelessness. We are using that definition to count how many homeless people there are, to develop funding programs, to have guidelines for organizations that are going to write grants to deal with homelessness, and very little has changed in that regard. But I think it's important and interesting to think a little bit about what these three categories might look like and which ones are most relevant to rural areas. So I'm going to show you a slide with lots of words on it. Don't panic. Don't try to write down everything on the slide. But I'm just trying to show you how complex the federal government's actual definition of what Fitchen would call literal homelessness is. So this is according to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. You can kind of see the Department of Housing and Urban Development oversees homelessness grant funding and programs in the United States. And they have this word urban in their title. And you can really see in many ways the urban, I don't know if it's a bias, but it's sort of a slant of that department and how they think about homelessness. So here's how the federal government defines homelessness. People who are living in a place not meant for human habitation, a barn, a tent, a vehicle, people living in an emergency shelter, in transitional housing, or exiting an institution where they temporarily resided. What do you think that last one is? Prison or jail, yeah. Families with children or unaccompanied youth who are unstably housed and likely to continue in that state. So you see, if kids are involved, the definition broadens a little bit. People who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, have no other residence, and lack the resources or support networks to obtain other permanent housing. So the definition expands a little bit when you're talking about people who are leaving domestic violence. And then people who are losing their primary nighttime residence, which may include a motel or hotel or doubled up situation within 14 days and lack resources or support networks to remain in housing. That's a little bit broader. But basically what we see in this definition is it's pretty narrow. It does not include people who are couch surfing. It does not include people who are doing what Fitchen calls doubling up, living in a small apartment with many more people that are meant to do that. It does not include a situation where you might have 3 families living in a 2-bedroom apartment together. It does not include really people who are sort of moving from place to place, staying with friends. If you have a couch to sleep on, or if you are crammed, many people crammed into an apartment, the federal government does not consider you homeless. So interesting. And Janet Fitchen really argues in her article that this misses the reality. This definition misses the reality of homelessness for many people in rural communities. So the federal government uses this definition to determine access to funding, programs, who gets into a homeless shelter. It really uses these definitions to figure out how to provide housing to families and children, which is a really important growing segment of the population, especially during the pandemic. But Janet Fitchen in her article tells us that less than 15% of the homeless adults in her study were literally homeless in the most narrow sense of being without shelter or living in cars or abandoned buildings. So she said 85% of the people she talked to, remember she worked with nonprofit organizations, she worked with welfare relief agencies, she used different social networks in these multiple communities that she studied. 85% of the people in her study would not be considered homeless according to the government. Although we know from reading these excerpts and these case studies that she provides us that everyone in her sample was incredibly precariously housed. You know how there's that saying like many X percentage of Americans, I don't know what it is, are 1 paycheck away from being homeless. These were people that were in many cases $20 or $30 or $40 away from becoming homeless in Fitchen's study. So Fitchen also argues that one of the most important aspects of homelessness and something that really shapes how the federal government thinks about homelessness is that they assume that most people that are homeless are visible in some way. And we see this in Missoula. If you go downtown, or maybe you're walking on the Kim Williams Trail, or you go somewhere at night and you see somebody sort of sleeping on a street corner, sleeping under a bridge, sleeping in some place where you're not supposed to be sleeping, but you can see them sleeping. Fitchen says this idea that homelessness is visible is also inaccurate in rural areas. So Fitchen tells us on page 178, even during a spell of homelessness, rural people are apt to be widely dispersed rather than congregated in shelters, in part because few small towns have shelters and because rural people tend to rely more on informal social networks than formal agencies for housing assistance. So Fitchen says you're very unlikely to find a homeless shelter in a small rural community because you simply don't have the population density to quote unquote support or necessitate a homeless shelter. But Fitchen says just because you can't walk through a small town or a rural area and see people sleeping in places not fit for human habitation doesn't mean that there's not homelessness. Just because homelessness is not necessarily that visible in rural areas doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So let me pause for a minute and see if anyone wants to jump in with a clarifying question before I keep going. We're just really in the like definitional part, but I promise you it will end soon. Okay. So the federal government, when it develops policies around homelessness, relies very heavily on this enumeration strategy called the point in time count. every what's called a continuum of care, or loosely defined a community that wants to get federal funding for homelessness has to participate in this point in time count. On the same day, every year, every community in the United States goes out and counts their homeless population. Usually that date is in late January, and typically the point and count study, it's done in close collaboration with all agency providers. So in Missoula, the Poverello Center, the Food Bank, Missoula 316, Salvation Army, all these places get together and coordinate to try to count the homeless population. They go through shelters, they go to the library and talk to people, and then there's a whole list of outdoor camping areas that volunteer enumerators go to and actually try to do a little mini census of the homeless population. This point and time count is the basis of all of our federal statistics about homelessness. But it's deeply problematic because it takes place in the coldest part of the year. Some people who are homeless, who are what we would call chronically homeless, meaning they have been homeless for a long time or have experienced many cycles of homelessness in their lifetime, some portion of that population, that's about 11% of the homeless population, so a much smaller proportion than we often think it is because they're the most visible segment. Many people in that situation have a seasonal movement around the country following the weather. So in places like Tucson, Arizona, Austin, Texas, some parts of New Mexico, California, the homeless population really grows in the winter and then contracts in the summer as people move back either to the areas that they're from or places with more temperate climate. So when you count the homeless population in January, our numbers in a place like Missoula are going to seem much lower than they actually are in the summer. I understand you got to pick something. You got to pick a date and you got to stick with it. But those point in time numbers are pretty problematic for the state, for states like ours. So this is some data. I know you can't really see this. I'm sorry. I can send these slides to Dan and he can send them out if you want on Moodle. Yeah. So these are some point in time counts. You can see PIT, point in time estimates of people experiencing homelessness, 2007 to 2019. And you can really see that the federal government breaks out these numbers. The blue circle is all homeless people. The gray squares in the middle are people in shelters, people sleeping in shelters. And then the little green arrows are unsheltered people, people who were counted outside of a shelter environment who say, I don't sleep in the shelter, or I'm not sleeping in the shelter this week, something like that. So you see that the number of unsheltered people is much, much smaller than the number of sheltered people, but a not insignificant portion of the population. This you can't even see. I'll send it to you. You can take a look at it. But these are demographic numbers really telling us something about the age. The 73% of people in the United States who are homeless are over the age of 24. 60% are male. 78% are non-Hispanic Latino. And a big portion, about 47%, 48% identify as white, and about 40% identify as African American. So some really interesting data. You can click on this link. You can look at the national demographics, and then you can look at all the data by state for this point in time count. And the Department of Housing and Urban Development releases a report every single year. I wasn't able to find a 2020 report. I think it's probably been delayed by the pandemic. I assume there was a point in time count last January before the pandemic. Was there one this January? I'm not sure. But take all of the national data about homelessness with a total grain of salt. It is our best shot, but pretty problematic in various ways. So then what about rural homelessness? Some people were asking about data. The best study about rural homelessness came out in 2010, so it's quite old at this point. I hope that this National Alliance to End Homelessness will release another study after the 2020 census data comes out, but there have been some massive problems with that 2020 census data, and so We're going to have to take the 2020 census data also with a grain of salt. But this is an analysis of this national point-in-time data that looks at geography. So it looks at communities that are rural, mostly rural, urban-rural mix, which is really how they're talking about suburbs, mostly urban and urban. And it's really showing us the breakdown of homelessness. So one reason why our understanding of rural homelessness is so sketchy is that rural homelessness actually makes up a very small sliver of homelessness in the United States. According to this this report from 2010, this data from 2007, it's about 16%, no, it's about 7% of homelessness in the US is considered to be rural or mostly rural. Now, you're like, well, if the enumerators are going out and trying to find people who look homeless and send them and ask them these questions for the point in time, and if we know from Janet Fitchen that rural homelessness is not that visible, is it possible that we've missed many people who are homeless in rural areas? Totally. So this is an undercount, but you can sort of see why there's this emphasis in the data on urban homelessness. So Fitchen really argues that for all of these reasons, in order to understand rural homelessness, we should adapt a different functional definition, what she calls potentially homeless. She tells us on page 190, the more significant problem in rural areas is not literal homelessness, but poor people who are just a day away or a relative away from literal homelessness. And she then tells us on page 186, it appears that rural people maintain a roof over their heads most of the time and rarely resort to shelters or welfare paid motels. And we would say, well, one reason for this is there aren't really that many homeless shelters in rural areas. It's very, very rare. Okay, so we know sort of what is rural homelessness. And then I just want to say a little bit about what do we know about rural homelessness from the scholarly research. Well, the scholarly research on rural homelessness tends to focus on three research questions that are not the most exciting sociological research questions you'll ever hear in your life. One is, does rural homelessness exist? And then every study is like, yes, it does. And then you're like, that's not like the greatest, most robust research question. How is it distinct from urban homelessness? And then how do the lack of services in rural areas affect people experiencing homelessness? So one thing that's a little tricky about the research on rural homelessness is that people conducting research on this topic do not use a consistent definition of rural. So many of the articles about rural homelessness that I've read, you sort of look at the case where they collected data and you're like, oh, that's a city of 60,000 people. It's actually not rural, even though it felt rural to the researcher. So this research on rural homelessness is a little sketchy as well. But a lot of it is really trying to get us to think about how does rural homelessness differ from urban homelessness? So I'll say a little bit about that and then I'll switch gears and talk about my project. So there's the prevailing wisdom about urban homelessness is that people that are homeless in urban areas are hypermobile, that some of them move frequently between cities looking for economic opportunities, weather, or following their personal connections. And the research on urban homelessness also argues that people who are homeless in urban areas are tremendously mobile within the city, so that they move from part of the city to other part of the city, seeking services, privacy, or avoiding policing, avoiding being policed. So then a lot of the research about rural homelessness makes two very contradictory arguments about mobility in particular. Some people that study homelessness in rural areas argue that people who are homeless in rural areas are stuck, that they tend to be much more resource deprived than their urban counterparts, that they lack their own transportation and there's very little public transportation in rural places, and that they often are part of social networks that keep them stuck in rural areas. So one strain of the research about rural homelessness is like, oh, these people are like sad and tragic and they're trapped and they can't get out of these horrible situations and they don't have a car or they're living in their car and it's broken down and they're trapped in these rural areas. What does Fitchen say about mobility and rural homelessness? Exactly. From town to town. So Fitchen argues that actually people that are homeless in rural areas are what she would call hypermobile, that they're constantly moving from town to town in a given region, not like from New York to New Mexico, but within rural New York, they're moving from little town to little town, trying to chase work opportunities and really trying to find cheaper or safer housing to live in. So within our understanding of rural homelessness, there's a little bit of a debate about how mobile rural people are. There's an assumption that people who are homeless in urban situations are very mobile. And then there's a sense that people who are homeless in rural areas are either stuck or hypermobile depending. I find much more evidence for this hypermobility argument that Fitchen makes, especially when looking at people that I interviewed that became homeless or grew up in rural parts of Montana or the West, that they really tend to move around a lot more than this, the people that are arguing that they're stuck. The other big concept that I want to introduce as we talk about rural homelessness is this idea of what's often called the rural idle. Has anyone heard this topic? They might talk about it like in some environmental studies classes or like wilderness studies classes, but essentially rural idle is nostalgic sentimentality about the nature of small town life. It really comes out of this research about rural communities and rural housing and homelessness that comes out of the UK. Another way to describe it is rurality involving naturalness as a setting for idyllic or individual lifestyles. And I really found in this research that I conducted with my students that this idea of rural idle presented itself many, many times over the course of the study, although not necessarily in expected ways. So I think we see lots of examples of the rural idle here in Missoula, even though this is not a rural setting. And I think we see lots of examples of it in how the University of Montana advertises or markets itself to prospective students. So this is my favorite example. This, apply to UM, visit us and see why UM is the right place for you. It's, it's this bucolic, natural, sentimental scene. Okay, so I conducted this project with a bunch of students who went through a service learning class that I taught for about 7 years that was really located at the local homeless shelter, and then we had a lot of coursework in sociology. And the students in that class with me collected 81 in-depth interviews with people using services at the Poverello Center, not necessarily sleeping there, but using services. And the project has 3 motivating questions. So one thing I'm really interested in is how does the culture and the geography of the region we're in, called the Intermountain West, how does it shape people's experience of homelessness here? What are the mobility patterns of people experiencing homelessness in the region? Are they hypermobile or are they stuck? And then how do people that are experiencing homelessness in the Intermountain West make sense of their own trajectories or mobility around the area? So I'm locating Montana in its larger region, which we call the Intermountain West. This is really the region here. It is, the region spans the area west of the Rockies and east of the Cascades and the Sierra Nevadas. The region contains several large booming cities. It contains the 6th largest city in the US, which is Phoenix, but it also contains some of the most sparsely populated areas of the country. So 6 of the 10 least populated states in the US are in the Intermountain West. So it's a really interesting place to study mobility and homelessness and rurality because it's a region that contains big cities and really rural areas. It's also a region with pretty extreme weather. In the northern part of the Intermountain West, we have quite brutal winters. According to me, I'm from Maryland. I consider the winters here to be very cold. I understand not everybody shares that perspective. But it also contains areas in Arizona and New Mexico that also have, and Nevada, that also have extreme weather, but really, really hot weather. So with my students over a number of years, we did a bunch of volunteer hours at the Poverello Center, got to know people, developed rapport, and then the students on my research team ended up conducting 81 semi-structured conversational interviews. We had a couple questions, we asked the questions, but really the data collection process sounded and felt a lot more like a conversation between 2 people than like a survey. You take a survey online and it's like, I don't know, the one that always sticks with me is I used to always take these surveys for the Gap and Old Navy, because then they would give you like a free coupon. And my favorite question was like, Old Navy is a store for people like me. And then it was like, strongly agree. And I was like, this question is insane. Like, what are they even talking about? But a qualitative sociological interview feels very little like a survey and more like a conversation. It's kind of a conversation with purpose. My team had a plan. They had some things they wanted to know, but they largely let the interviewees lead the conversation. So what that meant is we didn't have like perfect sets of data where every person answered the same question in the same order in the same way. But we really got a sense of what issues were important or interesting to people, because we would ask big questions like, how did you come to be staying at the shelter? You know, and then they would say a little bit, and then we would ask follow up. They would say a little bit, well, what happened when you were a kid? And then another question was sort of, how did you end up homeless? And then another question was sort of, what are your hopes for the future? Everything other than those three basic questions really depended on the direction that the person wanted to take the conversation. I did all the coding and analysis using a mixture of inductive and deductive approaches. Deductive really means, if you're not familiar with it in the social sciences, it means, okay, Edwards and Cloak say that rural people are stuck. Fitchin says that rural people are hypermobile. I'm going to look in the interviews for evidence that contradicts or supports these two perspectives. An inductive approach is really just looking at all the data that you collected and seeing what kind of emerges as themes or patterns from the data. I did a little bit of both. Yeah.
Just a quick question then. So when you have built rapport via volunteering, do the students spend a certain amount of time at the POV volunteering first just to getting to know people in that setting before they started doing these conversational interviews?
Yeah, so students in the class did around 35 hours of volunteer work over the course of the semester. So it was about 3 hours a week, and then collected these interviews right at the end of the semester. So basically they built up rapport working alongside people at the POV. A lot of their volunteers are actual residents of the shelter themselves, got to know people, and then approached people and asked if they wanted to be interviewed, people that they had gotten to know a little bit. So it was not like a structured survey between strangers, but more like a free-flowing conversation between not friends, but people that knew each other. We offered an incentive. It really depended on the year and how much money we had access to, but we always offered people at least $8, and some years it went up to $15. We paid people in cash. There's a whole debate in qualitative research about should you give people gift cards or cash? Should you not pay them at all? We always pay people in social science research. We pay them for their time. And a lot of people that study low-income people won't give people cash because they think people are going to use it wrong. And I think that's a problem. I think that's a problematic set of assumptions. I always give people cash, do whatever you want with the cash. It's none of my business how you use it. Who am I to know what you really need to use it for? But there are big debates about that. We can talk about it in the Q&A if you want. Good. So 81 interviews with people, not necessarily all staying at the shelter, but using services at the Poverello Center. And what I'm going to talk about just maybe for the next 10 minutes or so, and then I'll wind down and we can start the Q&A, is two of our findings. So what we were really interested in is in our sample, we had about a third of the people in our sample became homeless in a big urban area and traveled to Missoula after becoming homeless to be homeless here. Kind of counterintuitive. They came from cities like Cleveland, Chicago, other big, Seattle, Denver, big cities like that, where there actually are a lot of homeless services, and purposely moved to Missoula, often got a one-way bus ticket from somebody and came to Missoula. Half of the sample were people who became homeless in rural communities or small towns in the Intermountain West and became homeless there and then moved to Missoula. And then about a third of the people in the sample grew up and became homeless in Missoula and were kind of homegrown. So I'm going to talk about two different themes that we saw in the data. One I'm going to call rural idle, sort of how ideas of sentimental ideas of unspoiled nature or rural life either motivated people to come to Montana after becoming homeless or motivated people to stay here after becoming homeless, even though we have relatively few homeless services here. And then this concept that I'm going to call racial idle, which is how ideas about race and the demographics of Montana either drew people to Montana after becoming homeless or kept people here or drew them from other places back here that grew up here. About 85% of our sample was white. We did not ask people their race as part of the interview, so I only have data from people who revealed their race organically in their interview. But the vast majority of the people in our sample were white. There are some exceptions that I'll tell you about. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about rural idle, and then I'll talk a little bit about racial idle, which is my own term that I just coined to try to think about how sentimental ideas of a racially homogenous white community are driving some of the mobility decisions of the people in my sample. So idyllic notions of rural life and rurality loomed really large in these interviews. For participants who grew up in Montana, rurality, or real or imagined, kept them in the area after becoming homeless, even though if they had moved to a larger city like Spokane, even, they would have had access to many more resources there. So in her interview, one woman, these are all pseudonyms, named Vanessa, spoke about her decision to return to Montana after becoming homeless to provide her children with rural childhoods. So she lived in the Southeast United States for about 10 years. She's a white woman in her late 20s or early 30s. And she moved back to a rural area of Montana where she grew up when she was 4 months pregnant with her first child and either homeless or on the verge of homelessness, I don't remember. So she said in her interview, "We always did family things growing up. That's why I moved back to Montana to have my children, so that we could go camping and do all the things I really enjoyed doing while I was a kid." So in her interview, Vanessa and many other people described that move as a choice, and a conscious choice to get back to an idyllic natural environment that she was raised in. She did not think of herself or describe herself as being stuck. And although it certainly was a choice for her, her experience is really different than what we would call middle-class amenity migrants, people who move to Montana from other places with resources, with jobs, because they want to recreate here. Vanessa had no income and no housing when she moved back to Montana. And so she stayed with family in a trailer in the backyard of a family member's house. That living situation became untenable because of the heavy drinking and unpredictable behavior of one of the relatives. She was forced to seek help from local agencies in that rural area and have ended up moving to Montana to live in a transitional housing unit for families. So what's striking to me about this example is she doesn't say, "I was desperate, I was fleeing a relationship, I had no prospects in the Southeast." She really views her decision to move back to Montana with no resources as a choice, and a choice motivated by a desire to replicate her rural childhood. Other participants who grew up and became homeless in large cities were drawn to Montana by another type of rural idol. They really talked about scenic beauty. This is somewhat unexpected because Missoula is an urban area, although much smaller than many of the cities that they moved from. But it was an interesting narrative that appeared again and again in these interviews. So Alice, who's a 54-year-old woman and grew up and became homeless in large urban areas, said, apropos of nothing during her interview, "I love Montana." And so the interviewer said, "What about Missoula do you love the most?" And she said, "It would be the mountains. I look out almost any window in just about any direction and I can see them. I love that. I don't know what it is about them that just fascinates me. And the big sky, there is a big sky. I never seen so many stars in my life as I have here." So these sentiments are common. You've probably heard people say them, maybe you've said them yourself in Montana and in the region more broadly. What's interesting to me about this quote is that Alice is looking out the window of the local homeless shelter and talking about how the scenic beauty of Montana drew her here and keeps her here. One other point about sort of this draw of rurality, and then I'll talk a little bit about this idea of racial idol. A lot of people that grew up and became homeless in big cities and then moved to Montana after becoming homeless really were drawn by this other aspect of rural idol, which they would talk about as this sense of freedom. This was true for Brian, who is a 56-year-old African-American man who grew up and became homeless in some medium-sized Rust Belt cities. He first moved to Montana when he was 17. He moved to escape city life and entered Job Corps, a training and job skills program for young people who have struggled to complete or stay in college. Talking about that period in his life, he said, I had gotten tired of staying in that city by then. You know, the city life was dead for me after being out here. First time for me ever seeing the mountains other than on television. I was on my own and the freedom was off the hook, man. It was awesome. He's talking about being in Job Corps here. So 40 years later, after living and working in several large US cities and then becoming homeless in a large city on the plains, Brian was looking for change, and he remembered that sense of freedom he had felt in Montana as a young man. He brought a Greyhound ticket. He traveled to Missoula on the bus, used the last of his money to rent a room at a local motel for 2 nights, and then checked himself into the homeless shelter. Despite the fact that he was staying in a crowded shelter, he still talked about the freedom and wide open space of Montana with great enthusiasm during his interview. So the draw of rurality was really an interesting theme that emerged in the interviews that we didn't expect. But a second theme was, I would argue, even more interesting. And this is what I call the racial idol, or the pull and push of race. Participants were not asked direct questions about race in their interviews. And nobody said, oh, I was really interested in the racial idol, or I was pulled or pushed by race. This is a way that we take all of these stories as sociologists and we conduct an analysis to try to pull out these salient themes. So for some participants in the sample, race was really a push factor. This was true for participants who grew up in rural areas and people who grew up and became homeless in cities. For some of the people who grew up in rural areas or small cities in Montana, after becoming homeless, they talked a lot about their discomfort being in urban places and their resistance to moving to a larger city in order to to get resources. And they often framed their decisions in sometimes subtly and sometimes not subtly racial terms. So this is true of Melanie, a 21-year-old woman who grew up in a small city in Montana and then became homeless in a large city in the Intermountain West. When she lived in that city, she cohabitated with a family member, but then that family member got really sick and couldn't work anymore, and they had to move out of their apartment. And they just decided to move back to Montana. So talking about that city, Melanie says, it's not exactly the safest place in the world. There's a lot of fear and anxiety that kind of paralyzed me. I didn't really know what to do. I didn't want to go out. And I felt a lot of anxiety about how could I care for both of my kids when I was pregnant. Those are my worries. And then she kind of trails off. At the time she was being interviewed, she lived in a transitional housing facility for homeless families. And she talked a lot in her interview, unprompted, about how unsafe she felt in that big city and how much safer she felt back in Missoula. Many people made these kind of comments, and sometimes their comments about discomfort in urban places took on a much more obviously racialized tone. Melanie's did as well, not in this quote, but in other things that she said. But for a lot of participants who grew up and became homeless in large urban areas, their discomfort in urban places often turned into their anxiety about urban crime, real and imagined. So here's a quote by a guy named Terrence, who's a 60-year-old white man. He grew up and became homeless in urban areas, and then after becoming homeless, moved to Montana. And he's sort of talking about a hypothetical person in this city where he lived most of his life, this medium-sized Midwestern city. If he's out in that city, someone who's homeless, he'll get hurt, get robbed, or get raped, or mugged, or pillaged. Here, at least, talking about Missoula, all you got to worry about is the night cop coming and tapping you on the ankle saying, you can't sleep here. This is private property. You got to find another place to sleep. This quote contains some pretty violent imagery and reflects what I think are racialized anxieties about threats of random sexualized bodily violence. It's likely an inaccurate description of what it's like to sleep on the streets of this Midwestern city. But his description, Terrence's description of sleeping rough in Missoula, also really invokes rural idol. In this imagined idyllic scenario, the worst thing that a police officer in Missoula would do would be to ask Terrence to move along. This scenario is not accurate either. Many participants who had slept rough or slept outside on the streets in Missoula often described in their interviews being roughed up and in some cases arrested for sleeping outside in city limits. So if this seems subtle to you, I'm trying to make an argument that a lot of times these anxieties about urban crime or discomfort in urban environments really had a racialized tone in the sample. And so while race and anxiety about urban crime is a push factor, we also see race as a pull factor in these interviews as well. A lot of respondents, whether they grew up in Missoula and we're talking about why they didn't leave when they became homeless, or they grew up in a rural area, became homeless in an urban area and came home, or grew up and became homeless in an urban area and moved to Montana, the white participants in this sample, many of them talked about how they were pulled to Montana by what I would call racial idol, an idea that Montana is a racially homogenous, almost entirely white place where being a white person who's homeless, you will not be in the racial minority, but in fact will be in the majority. None of these things are actually true of Montana, but they really were a big part of the way that people talked about their mobility. So Audra, a 33-year-old woman who grew up and became homeless in urban areas in the region, invoked white homogeneity, safety, and purity when explaining her decision to move to Montana after becoming homeless. She talked in her interview a lot about racialized crime, the rise in undocumented immigrants in her city, and made a lot of comments about how sort of white people can't get ahead in that city. So then she became homeless, and she started to try to think about what she was going to do. And she hearkened back to time that she'd spent earlier in her life in Montana. She didn't grow up in Montana, she grew up in another city. But she says, for years we would vacation here in the summertime in Yellowstone and with her boyfriend's family in Missoula. Montana is a place of healing, beauty, and beautiful people. Her description stands in stark contrast to how she talked about her former city as a crime-ridden city that was the hapless victim of what she calls a Mexican invasion. For many participants in the sample, especially those from large cities, Montana really was attractive to them. They thought it would be a homogenous white community where they could be in the majority, even if they were homeless. And the draw of this racial homogeneity can't be underestimated. We know from living in Montana that it is not a completely white place. And if any of you have spent time in the Poverello Center, you know that in many ways, it's one of the most diverse, racially diverse institutions in town. So a lot of these folks were quite shocked when they arrived in Montana at the homeless shelter and were like, wait, what's happening? Sometimes they talked about it in very direct ways, sometimes indirect ways. But what I found really interesting were these ideas, these idyllic ideas of Montana were really drawing people at shaping their mobility, whether they were rural people coming to Missoula or urban people coming here. So I'll wrap up, just have maybe 2 more slides, I think. So mobility narratives were really important in this data set. The people in this data set talked about their mobility in abstract emotional terms. They really highlighted all of the choices that they made, even when those choices were incredibly constrained, and they downplayed a lot of the constraints on their choices. There was a strong draw for almost everyone in this sample of beauty, natural amenities. Many people in this sample talked about how much they loved living in Montana because there was so much recreation to be had. These were people that live in the local homeless shelter, but would wax nostalgic about the Clark Fork River like you have heard on every hike and at every bar in town or in any social gathering where people are going on and on about how great it is. People in our sample talked in the exact same terms about this place. And I would argue that race cast a really long shadow on how people talked about their mobility decisions and choices. So when we think about rural homelessness, although Missoula is not a rural place, many of the people in our sample were people that had grown up or become homeless in rural areas. And even the people that grew up in urban areas really were drawn to the rurality of Montana, even though they ended up living in the second largest city and what many people here experience as a city. So it really raises some questions for people that study rural homelessness about what are the most distinct features. So much of the research focuses on demographics, the causes. Are there people who are homeless in rural areas? What are those people like? Why do they become homeless? But I would argue that we really need to think about what are the experiences of being homeless in a rural place or a rural state, the way Janet Fitchen does? And then really to think more about patterns and decisions that people make about mobility and how rural idle and racial idle play into those things. So last slide, I think there are some really interesting implications for service providers and policymakers in actual rural areas or in urban areas of rural states. I think it's really important for service providers working in these contexts to understand that many people in a place like Montana are going to focus on their choices and preferences and are going to envision and talk about themselves as people that have choices to make and preferences, even when those choices are incredibly constrained. We did not hear a lot of language of victimization in our interviews, but instead a lot more nodding to these kind of Western values of hard work and independence and freedom. For service providers operating in places like Missoula or Billings or Bozeman or Kalispell, I think they're facing a lot of conflict among people in their shelters or agencies who have this idyllic, nostalgic, sentimental idea about rural Montana that are then confronted with the reality of getting services in an urban place in Montana. And I think service providers have to be aware and understanding that especially people that come here from somewhere else after becoming homeless are going to really be confronting a reality that's very different than what they thought it was going to be. And then I think it's really important that service providers confront and correct racial assumptions and aspirations of white people experiencing homelessness in Montana. That a lot of the white people in our sample really had some ideas about what it was going to be like for them to be homeless in Montana, and very few of those assumptions actually played out. And service providers were often confronted with a lot of frustration around those issues. So even though I talked about this in kind of big abstract terms, I think there are some really important on the ground implications that are important to take from this study. So I think I'll stop here and then I'll turn the floor over to Q&A. Okay. I feel like I was enthusiastically yelling about depressing things for like an hour. Is that what it felt like to you? Okay, good. That's my jam. Yeah, great question. So, okay.
Yeah. So I said if the federal definition of homelessness were to be expanded to account for those in rural communities, the reality of homelessness and extreme housing insecurity statistics in Montana would be significantly more stark. And my question following that just is, what can states and small communities do to support those on the edge of homelessness in these rural communities? And then as Dr. Rooks has been working on her manuscript, if she's come across any remarkable steps being taken by rural communities themselves to address and support those that are not experiencing what Fitchen would deem literal homelessness.
Great. So a lot of the sort of policy making around homelessness is predicated on different assumptions about why people are homeless. So the federal government has programs and funding sources, states have programs and funding sources, communities have funding sources and programs, and then charitable organizations, often operating independently of those federal and community dollars, are also doing other things. So people that work on homelessness, some of them work on giving people money for a down payment. Some of them work on getting people subsidized housing. Some of them work on building new housing stock. Some of them work on programs that give people interest-free loans or grants to fix up their houses so that they're not living in dilapidated housing. That's a big issue that Fitchen talks about in her article. Some of them focus on mental health, substance abuse. Really, you can learn a lot about how a program addresses the homelessness issue. You can learn a lot about their assumptions about what the problem is. So some people, when they talk about homelessness, are really focused on substance abuse. And certainly there are high levels of substance abuse among the homeless population. I would argue in the state of Montana, there are high levels of substance abuse. People that are homeless are in some ways different, but in many ways not different from the regular population. So people that focus all their energy on substance abuse are really kind of betting on this idea that people are homeless because they have drug or alcohol dependency. And once they solve that problem, then their homelessness will be solved. Some entities really look at job training, job skills. But I think one thing that Fitchen talks about, which I think is really relevant for Missoula, even though we're not a rural community, is this question of housing stock. How much housing is there in a community, and how affordable is it, and how habitable or inhabitable is it? So a lot of the work, the long-term work around homelessness in Missoula is really geared towards growing our stock of affordable housing. That's really what, as a community, Missoula has put its resources into. So several years ago, our mayor, John Engen, recruited this woman, Erin Fowler-Pihan, who ran the Poverello Center for maybe 10 years. He recruited her to become kind of the housing czar. That's not what her title is, but for the city of Missoula. And she is constantly hustling to develop programs and incentives and structures to get developers to build affordable housing, or to get developers to do set-asides of housing developments, like a certain percent is going to be set aside for people that make less than the median income in Missoula. So for Fitchen, Fitchen in her article is really talking about housing stock. How much is there? How good is it? How habitable is it? And then where the affordable housing, how far away from jobs is it? That's really what Fitchen is talking about. In Missoula, a lot of what our community has focused on is making sure that there's enough affordable housing. Many people in Missoula would argue that the homelessness problem is a result of the disjuncture between wages and the cost of housing here. Any of you that rent on the private market here in Montana understand the relationship between the minimum wage and rent is pretty out of whack here. I wanted to say one other thing about communities. Charitable organizations often have their own set of priorities and issues that they want to address. Some programs that deal with homelessness really look at behavior and trying to modify people's behavior. Others really try to get people into housing and keep them in there. The kind of thinking about where the government should intervene in homelessness has changed a lot in recent years. There's been a real shift towards what's called permanent supportive housing, acknowledging that some portion of our population will not be able to work and support themselves and may not be able to follow the rules of a homeless shelter or maintain sobriety. And so then the question that those communities have to ask themselves is, do we think that people in that category don't deserve to have a home? And in a place like Montana, are we willing to let them die on the streets? And some communities say, yeah, we don't think that they should have a home. If you can't stay sober, you don't deserve to be housed, and you're gonna, roll the dice with the weather. Missoula as a community really tries to, the local homeless agencies really believe that homelessness should not be a death sentence, and really do everything they can to keep people from dying of exposure on the street, but have really been trying to move forward with permanent supportive housing. The issue with permanent supportive housing, building a set of housing units that people will live in for the rest of their lives, that will be staffed, and there will be social workers, and maybe those people will be pursuing sobriety, maybe they won't. There's one big issue with permanent supportive housing and establishing it in a place. What do you think that might be?
Funding.
Funding is one of them. There's something that makes it even harder to establish. Yeah, who wants to live next to permanent supportive housing? Basically no one. So then the question in a place like Missoula is, if we don't have any of that housing and we want to build it, where's it going to go? And there have been a lot of community conversations about where that might be located, and they've been quite heated over the years. Yeah. So you hear that like not in my backyard, NIMBY. There's a lot of NIMBYism about permanent supportive housing and homeless shelters. Yeah. One last thing, and then I'll turn over to Luke. The Poverello Center moved about 5 or 6 years ago in town. They moved from one location to the other, and the shelter, in collaboration with the mayor, had like 3 or 4 public forums about where it should move, and basically hundreds of people would come and scream about, I don't want it in my neighborhood. And the woman that ran the shelter, who's now our kind of affordable housing czar, she said she called all these shelters in other cities around the country, and she said, well, how did you deal with the move? And every shelter was like, we've never moved. Like, homeless shelters don't move from one location to another because it's too hard. Our homeless shelter did move, but it was quite controversial in the community, and it would be very hard for them to successfully navigate another move. Yeah, great. Luke, I'll stop talking.
Have there been any states or localities that have like successfully taken the information from this article and applied it to help rural homelessness?
I think that people that work on rural homelessness, service providers, I'm sure they all know about Janet Fitchen's work, because she's really the #1 person that writes on this. You know, one community that I guess it wouldn't meet the rural definition, but there are a lot of sort of resort communities in Colorado and Wyoming. You know, Big Sky, Bozeman, it's not the same, but it's in that general gist, that have really been confronting massive housing insecurity in recent years. Places like Jackson Hole and Vail and Breckenridge and all the rural areas around there have really been struggling with how to deal with this. And I mean, not to be a bummer, but I am a sociologist. That's kind of our thing. I don't know of a community that has really crushed it in this regard. Some of the examples of urban communities that are kind of in the leading edge of homelessness, a lot of people look at Salt Lake City, and they had a 10-year plan. They have not ended homelessness. Every city is required to have a 10-year plan to end homelessness. The Department of Housing and Urban Development. Missoula has one, and then the 10 years ran out and they made a new one. It's like how when you come your first semester at college and your advisor's like, let's plan out your 4 years. And you're like, okay, but like, how do I know when these classes will be offered? And maybe I'll change my major. And is anyone in this situation, like if you're in 4-Bear, they're like, make a plan. And you're like, okay, but anything could change. That's kind of what the 10-year plan to end homelessness is. I don't know of I'm sorry to be a bummer. I should have come with an uplifting example. I don't know of a rural community that has really crushed this. Most rural communities are quite poor, and the ones that aren't are ones that are sort of growing in migration. You know, people are moving to, and there's more money in there, but then the housing stock is really pinched. Should have had something positive to say, I'm sorry.
I apologize if you've mentioned this already, but I just wanted to ask again. When you talk about the rural, like idle or like wanting to be in a rural place, does that also go for indigenous people of like people who are homeless that you interviewed?
Like, did they talk about the rural idle? Yeah, you know, it's interesting. We did have maybe 10 people in our sample who identified as indigenous, and most of them were from rural places in the region. And I don't know that they talked about it in the same way. It's a good question. I'd have to look at the data a little bit. Many of them talked about sort of various types of racism that they had confronted in their lives, but especially since becoming homeless. Sometimes in the shelter, sometimes for people that were like, that traveled around and were sort of hypermobile. They talked about different prejudice they had encountered. But yeah, it's a good question about how race shaped whether people talked about rural idle. I don't know the answer to that. I don't want to speculate, but it's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah.
I'm Isaiah. Hi. So we have this definition that you've been talking about of expanding like rural homelessness to accommodate people that are like barely ahead of the curve, like on the move a lot and just like kind of just making it through. I guess my question is, why can't we expand that in the urban setting as well? Because I'm guessing there's just as much of a proportion of those people to cities?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's two-part, like, why not? And then also, why might the federal government be resistant to that? I think if it's true that about 90+% of people that are homeless in the US are homeless in rural areas, and that probably means that about 90% of the federal money for homelessness goes to urban areas. If you extended the definition to people that were precariously housed, or sometimes we use the phrase housing insecure, then your homelessness money is sort of taking on the problem of poverty, you know? And so the Department of Housing and Urban Development might be like, okay, but we can't also solve the problem of poverty. But then you're like, okay, well, what would solve the problem of poverty? Well, a lot of people, you know, this is a big issue that's going to be really hotly debated in the next year about the minimum wage. I mean, a lot of people that take on housing precarity or insecurity really would argue that the minimum wage does not allow you to have a reasonable, to meet your basic needs in most places. We might also look at our poverty threshold. You know, our poverty threshold is, do you guys know this? It's 3 times the cost of how much it would cost to feed yourself, to keep yourself alive with basic food. But we know that the cost of living is radically different across the country. And the poverty threshold is only adjusted for Alaska and Hawaii and then lower 48. There's the same poverty threshold across the lower 48. So then if you're like, oh, the poverty threshold determines whether you have access to food stamps, rental assistance, all that stuff. Anyway, I think the reason it has not changed is because the Department of Housing and Urban Development is like, we cannot take on the issue of poverty in the United States. But then you're like, now which federal agency will take on poverty? I mean, that's a good, Housing and Human Services? I don't know. It's a great question. I think Fitchen is making a narrower argument because she understands that if you were to expand it for urban areas also, it would just create this much bigger problem that then had to be solved under the rubric of homelessness. It's not going to create a problem, but it's going to create more demand on that agency. Yeah. God, I'm just like negative today. Okay, I'm going to end with something hopeful.
This might be more negative.
Great, let's bring it on.
Yeah, and might be a bit convoluted, but kind of going off of that. I've just read reports or just heard stories, and by stories I mean like journalism, about how I guess kind of these crisis centers or any kind of homeless centers that are trying to allocate some kind of resources to people are kind of stuck in the system of checking boxes, right? People are requiring these people to kind of directly identify how this kind of correlates with their situation. And I was just wondering if you had anything that maybe you could reflect on and how we allocate resources to people that really can't identify this as like the problem that they're facing.
Yeah, do you mean like that different agencies make people that are homeless jump through a lot of hoops in order to get resources, or do you mean something different? That's,
I guess, what I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I think like the sort of world of housing and homelessness is an incredibly bureaucratic world. And federal thinking about the best solutions to housing problems in the US changes a lot. It used to be, there was this model that was like, okay, people needed to be sober and sort of like functional members of society before we would give them housing. And so then people had to like prove that they were, you know, upright citizens before they would get housing. Then the thinking changed to this housing first model, house people first, then help them deal with their other problems. Like who can confront their sobriety issues when they're living underneath a bridge? You know, the thinking kind of changed on that. And then I think we're probably about to enter a new era of thinking about what's going to work and what do we need to give people and what do we need to insist on from people as a result of the pandemic. I mean, homelessness rates, here we go, we're getting even darker. Homelessness rates are going up and up and up because of the pandemic. We're seeing more and more different kinds of people becoming homelessness as a result of unemployment related to the pandemic. And I bet as our understanding of who's homeless and why they're homeless changes, and as more people know more people that became homeless, I bet our thinking as a country yet again will evolve. And my hope is that it evolves into something more humane and something that really recognizes the broad range of reasons that people become homeless. I think for many people, they have in their eyes, in their mind, an idea of who's homeless. It's usually a man, a single man who has a drinking problem, who sleeps on the street, who's aggressive. That's like 10% of the homeless population. I mean, that's the chronically homeless percentage. So in recent years, service providers have really tried to move away from that model where they get people to jump through a lot of hoops, and really have just tried to provide people with as many resources as possible. Federal housing assistance, like if you have a housing voucher or rental assistance, there are a lot of hoops that you have to jump through to get those. And if you are convicted of a violent felony, you lose your housing assistance and you can never get it again. If you go to jail for a felony and you come out of jail, you are oftentimes not eligible for Section 8. If you have a drug offense, you lose your housing eligibility, you can never get it back. So I think some of those bureaucratic red tape things hopefully will go away as a result of our more sophisticated understanding of homelessness. But it's kind of why I'm like, I do that hokey thing in the beginning where I insist on people first language. I think people first language really reminds us that people that are in this situation are human beings. Some of them made bad choices, some of them didn't. I know plenty of rich people who are terrible at managing their money and make horrible choices in their life. I know plenty of poor people who are very much better at budgeting than I am and make good choices. So I guess I am a little hopeful that those federal policies and sort of those hoops and the bureaucracy will evolve as we become more empathetic and knowledgeable about homelessness as a society.
Yeah. And Dan, is it all right if I ask another one?
I got one question here in the chat box.
Yeah.
If I
Okay.
can chat that, because then we're going to out of time. Can you guys still hear me? Is the mic still working? Okay. This is a question from Ray, and it says, does Fitchen's article still hold true today, or have things changed? Are sociologists missing counting people like illegal populations living in barely habitable environments, child labor camps around chicken farms, slaughterhouses, farm workers, et cetera? Does that figure into this housing insecurity or rural homelessness?
Yeah, so Fitchen talked about people that worked in agriculture, but didn't talk about migrant labor. I think this person is really referring to migrant labor. Not all migrant workers are undocumented, and not all of them are immigrants. Some of them are migrants who travel around the country, but maybe they grew up here or were born in the United States. The point in time count really is most effective in areas where the counting is done by local agencies that work with people and populations. So to the extent that a community has migrant workers or immigrant farm workers, and there's a community organization that works with them, and that community organization is involved in the count, the numbers are going to be better. But a lot of people actually who are migrant workers don't meet that literal definition of homelessness, because a lot of people who are migrant workers live in short-term housing provided by their employer. So they wouldn't even meet that definition at all. I don't know. It'd be interesting. I have to think a little bit about what Fitchen has to say about that population. There are not a lot of poultry processing or meat processing plants in New York State. That's why those folks didn't show up in her study. Yeah.
The larger point. Can you hear me, anybody?
I can make this as quick as possible, but I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on the difference between qualitative and quantitative research, like specifically paying people to speak with you, and whether or not you found that kind of incentivizing that kind of participation influenced the responses you were getting.
Are you a journalism student?
Yes.
Okay, great. This is always the controversial issue with journalism students. So qualitative research is probably more similar to journalism than it is to quantitative research. Really, the goal with qualitative research is to very purposely recruit a number of people, talk to them, and try to pull themes and trends out of the data. We tend to do our sampling very differently than journalists do. We don't necessarily use personal connections or connections of other people. We instead try to do things like go to an agency and say, can you give us a list of all the people that receive services here, and we'll randomly pick every 10th person and invite them to participate. I know journalists are like, oh, we never pay our sources. It's completely insane to pay your sources. It's a problem. In qualitative research, we have a really different ethic about that. We really believe that we are taking people's time and their stories, and we're using their time and their stories in order for us to say something interesting that we want to shed light on a particular aspect of society. So qualitative researchers in anthropology, sociology, economics, political science, qualitative researchers in environmental studies, environmental science, feel very strongly that you should pay your participants. And we see it as a way to thank somebody for sharing their time and their story. I don't know what else to say other than that. I understand that journalists are like, that is bad shit. And sorry, did I say that?
Daisy, it's interesting because Rosalind up here raised that same issue, talked about the number of times that very wealthy or institutions, stuff like that, have a lot of resources, stuff like that, come to Native peoples and just expect them to be able to talk to them with no compensation at all. And she's like, your people are making your livelihood off of this here, and you're taking, advantage here. So she really argued that the compensation issue is really an ethical issue in that.
I think especially for people that do research on sort of disadvantaged, vulnerable, low-income communities, it's very important to them to pay people for their time. And then you're like, gift card or cash. I would say treat people like adults, let them make their own decisions, give them cash, and let them do whatever they want with it. But I know that's controversial. Yeah. Great. Well, I'll stick around. I'll let Dan wrap up, but I'll stick around if anyone wants to talk afterwards.
Yeah, we're unfortunately at the end of our time here, so we'll end the formal class at this point, but let's just thank Daisy for this. Has really been a fantastic. We're just now moving into the kind of the contemporary issues in Montana portion of the course here, and so this leads us off here. But it was really fascinating because we've been talking particularly about Montana myths, and I think a lot of what you're talking about here works really well. Particularly Native peoples, talking about the myths of the frontier, the myths of the empty space and things like that, which were fully inhabited, and the displacement of Native peoples because of those myths here. And so like your rural ideal and your racial ideal really fit nicely into this notion about how the stories we tell, the perceptions we have, shape the behaviors that result from that. So great. Really, really great. So thank you so much. So yeah, I'm gonna end the Zoom recording here. Maybe can you put the stop share button on yours there? And then if you've got further questions and want to talk to Daisy one-on-one with good social distancing, feel free to come forward and do that. But thank you so much, Daisy.
Thank you.
It was great.